The Abandoned Asylum. The old asylum had been abandoned for years, but rumors persisted that something still lurked within its walls. Emily had always been fascinated by the macabre, and she couldn't resist the opportunity to explore the asylum with her friends. They arrived at night, when the moon was high in the sky. The building loomed over them, its windows shattered, and its doors hanging off their hinges. Emily's heart raced as she stepped inside. The asylum was in a state of decay. The walls were covered in mold, and the floors were slick with grime. As they made their way deeper into the building, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Suddenly, a door creaked open, and Emily spun around, but there was no one there. Her friends laughed and teased her, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they continued to explore, they heard strange noises coming from the walls. It sounded like scratching, as if something was trying to break through. Emily's friends were unnerved, but Emily was filled with a strange sense of excitement. They soon found themselves in the basement. The air was thick and musty, and it was almost pitch black. Emily could hear her friends breathing heavily as they descended the stairs. That's when they heard it, a low, guttural growling sound coming from the darkness ahead. Emily's heart raced as she realized that they weren't alone. "Guys, we need to get out of here," she whispered, but it was too late. The growling grew louder, and they could hear something shambling towards them from the darkness. Emily's friends screamed as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a twisted, grotesque creature with long claws and a gaping maw. Emily knew that it was the stuff of nightmares, but she couldn't move. The creature lunged at her, its claws digging into her flesh. Emily screamed as it pulled her into the darkness, leaving her friends behind. When the police found her the next morning, she was in shock. She told them about the creature, but they didn't believe her. They searched the asylum, but they found nothing. Emily was left to live the rest of her life haunted by the memory of the abandoned asylum and the creature that lurked within its walls. The end. The Demon's Game. It all started when a group of teenagers stumbled upon an old board game in the attic of an abandoned house. The game was called the Demon's Game, and it had strange symbols and markings on the board. Despite the warnings etched on the box, the teenagers decided to play the game. They soon realized that the Demon's Game was not like any other game they had played before. It seemed to have a mind of its own, and the pieces moved on their own accord. The players felt like they were being watched, and they heard whispers and footsteps that no one else could hear. As the game progressed, the players began to experience strange and terrifying things. Objects in the room moved on their own, and the temperature dropped dramatically. The players began to see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the room, and they felt like they were being followed wherever they went. One of the players, a girl named Alice, was the first to succumb to the game's power. She was possessed by a demon, and her eyes turned black as she began to speak in a voice that was not her own. The demon spoke through her, promising to release the other players from the game if they did its bidding. The other players, terrified and desperate to escape, agreed to the demon's demands. They were given a list of tasks to complete, each one more horrific than the last. They had to sacrifice animals, desecrate graves, and perform other unspeakable acts. As they completed each task, the demon's power grew strong. It was no longer content with possessing just one person, and it began to possess the other players one by one. They were consumed by the darkness, and their souls were lost forever. The game continued for weeks, and the players became more and more twisted with each passing day. The demon had complete control over them, and they did its bidding without question. They had become its slaves, trapped in a nightmare from which they could not escape. In the end, the house burned to the ground, and the game was destroyed. But the demon's influence lingered on, and the players were never the same. They became outcasts, shunned by society, and haunted by the memories of what they had done. The Demon's Game had claimed its victims, and it would continue to claim more as long as there were those who dared to play its deadly game. The end. The Haunted Dolls. Alice had always been fascinated by dolls. As a child, she spent hours playing with them, rearranging the tiny furniture and creating stories for the dolls that lived inside. When she grew up, she started collecting antique dolls, filling her home with their intricate beauty. But there was one doll that was different from all the rest. It was a Victorian-style mansion with stained glass windows and a grand staircase. Alice had found it in an old antique shop, and she had felt drawn to it from the moment she saw it. She had bought it and brought it home, eager to add it to her collection. But something was off about this doors. Alice couldn't put her finger on what it was, but she had a feeling that it was haunted. She would often catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Sometimes she could swear that she heard tiny voices coming from the doors, whispering secrets to each other. One night, Alice was unable to sleep. She lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the haunted doors. She decided to get up and investigate. As she approached the doors, she felt a cold breeze and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She slowly pushed open the front door of the doors, and as she did, the tiny chandelier in the entrance hall flickered to life. Alice peered inside, and she saw that the dolls had come to life. They were moving around the doors as if they were alive. They were whispering to each other, and Alice could hear snippets of their conversations. She stepped closer, trying to get a better look, but as she did, the dolls all turned to look at her. Their faces were twisted into expressions of rage and hatred, and Alice felt a surge of fear wash over her. Suddenly, the dolls began to move towards her, their tiny feet tapping against the wooden floors. Alice tried to back away, but she tripped and fell, and the dolls were upon her. They dragged her into the dolls, and Alice found herself in a world of darkness and terror. The dolls were no longer the innocent playthings that she had loved as a child. They were monsters filled with a thirst for blood and revenge. Alice tried to fight them off, but they were too strong. She screamed for help, but her cries went unheard. She was trapped in the dolls, and there was no escape. As the night wore on, Alice's screams faded into silence. Her body was never found, and the haunted dolls remained on display in her home, a warning to all those who dared to enter. The end. The Haunting of Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor was an old and imposing mansion that stood on a hill overlooking the town. It had been abandoned for many years, and its dark and foreboding exterior gave the townspeople a sense of unease. Despite the warnings of the locals, a young couple named David and Sarah decided to buy the mansion and make it their home. At first, the couple was thrilled with their new home. They spent hours exploring its many rooms and admiring its antique furnishings. But as the days went by, strange things began to happen. Doors would open and close on their own, and strange whispers could be heard echoing through the halls. Sarah began to feel a sense of dread every time she entered certain rooms in the mansion. She felt as though she was being watched, and she could sense a dark and malevolent presence in the house. One night, David woke up to find Sarah sitting up in bed. Her eyes wide with terror, she told him that she had seen a figure standing at the foot of the bed, staring at her with glowing red eyes. David tried to reassure her that it was just her imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the weeks went by, the haunting became more and more intense. Objects would move on their own, and eerie moans could be heard coming from the walls. David and Sarah began to feel as though they were being suffocated by the oppressive atmosphere in the mansion. As one night, David decided to investigate the source of the haunting. He ventured down into the mansion's dark and foreboding basement, and he found a hidden room filled with strange and ancient artifacts. As he studied the objects, he realized that they were linked to an ancient and malevolent spirit that had been summoned by the previous owner of the mansion. David knew that he had to act quickly to save himself and Sarah from the malevolent spirit. He gathered all of the artifacts from the hidden room and performed a ritual to banish the spirit from the mansion. As he completed the ritual, he felt a sense of peace wash over the house. The mansion was never haunted again, and David and Sarah were able to live out the rest of their days in peace. But the memory of the haunting lingered with them, a constant reminder of the dark and malevolent forces that lurked in the shadows of Blackwood Manor. That's the end. The Witching Hour. It was well past midnight when Sarah decided to take a walk in the woods. She had always been drawn to the darkness and the quiet of the forest, and tonight was no exception. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting an eerie glow over the trees. As Sarah walked deeper into the woods, she began to feel uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, she heard a rustling in the bushes. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Then out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a woman, dressed in rags and carrying a basket. "Good evening, child," the woman said, her voice raspy and low. "What brings you to the woods at this hour?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I just wanted to take a walk. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." The woman smiled. but it was a cold and unsettling smile. "No harm done, my dear, but be careful in these woods, they're dangerous, especially at this hour." With that, the woman turned and disappeared into the darkness. Sarah continued on her walk, but her unease only grew. She felt as though she was being followed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As she walked, the trees began to thin out, and she found herself in a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows boarded up and its roof caving in, but there was a light coming from inside. Sarah approached the cabin, her heart racing. She could hear strange noises coming from inside, and the light was flickering like a dying flame. She knew she should turn back, but she couldn't resist the urge to investigate. The cabin, she found herself in a room filled with strange objects. There were jars filled with unknown substances, strange symbols etched into the walls, and a cauldron sitting in the center of the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and she heard the sound of a lock clicking into place. She turned to run, but the room was spinning, and she felt as though she was being pulled into the ground. When she woke up, she was in a dark and damp cell, her arms and legs bound with chains. She could hear the sound of chanting coming from somewhere in the darkness, and she knew that she was not alone. In the corner of the cell, she saw the woman from the woods. She was no longer dressed in rags, but was wearing a long, flowing robe. Her face was painted with strange symbols, and her eyes were glowing with an otherworldly light. "Welcome to my lair, child," the woman said, her voice low and raspy. "You have been chosen to be my apprentice, to learn the ways of the dark arts, and to serve me for all eternity." Sarah tried to struggle free, but the chains were too strong. She knew that there was no escape. She had entered the witching hour, and there was no turning back. Sarah knew that she was in grave danger, trapped in the lair of a powerful and dark witch. She had heard stories of witches and their dark magic, but she had never believed that they were real. Now, she was living a nightmare. The woman continued to speak in a low, hypnotic voice, telling Sarah of the power that she would gain by serving the witch. Sarah knew that she had to find a way to escape, but she was bound and trapped. The days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Sarah was forced to study the dark arts, learning the ways of spells and incantations. The woman, who called herself the Black Witch, was a demanding and cruel master. Sarah was beaten and punished whenever she made a mistake, and the witch seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. But Sarah was determined to escape. She spent every moment plotting her escape, trying to find a weakness in the witch's defenses. She discovered that the witch was vulnerable to silver, and she began to gather pieces of silver whenever she could. One night, as the witch slept, Sarah managed to free herself from her chains. She took a piece of silver and crept up behind the witch, intending to strike her down. But as she raised the silver, the witch's eyes snapped open. With a flick of her wrist, the witch sent Sarah flying across the room. She hit the wall hard, and her head spun. When she opened her eyes, the witch was standing over her, a dark smile on her lips. "You foolish child," the witch said. "Did you really think that you could defeat me? I'm more powerful than you can imagine." Sarah knew that she was matched, but she refused to give up. She summoned all of her strength and launched herself at the witch, holding the silver in front of her. The two women tumbled to the ground, and Sarah plunged the silver into the witch's heart. For a moment there was silence, then the witch let out a blood-crushed scream, and a wave of dark energy surged through the room. Sarah was thrown back, and everything went black. When she woke up, she was outside the cabin, the sun just rising over the horizon. She was battered and bruised, but alive. She knew that she had defeated the witch, but at a great cost. She would never be the same again. The witch had left a dark mark on her soul, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The end.